Popee the Performer is a CGI animated series made for children, created by Ryuji Masuda, with character design and manga adaptation by Wakako Masuda. It aired on Kids Station in Japan from 2000 to 2001, spanning 39 episodes and a single special. Though technically categorized as a children's show, Popee is anything but ordinary. Actually, it's probably one of the top trauma animes in Japan, which, if you're wondering what a trauma anime is, it's a term used for shows that leave a strong emotional scar or psychological impact. At just about 5 minutes per episode, Popee the Performer delivers chaotic, slapstick-heavy stories stripped of spoken dialogue, relying instead on mime-like expression, exaggerated body movement, and a looping, slightly deranged soundtrack. The show was produced on a shoestring budget, reportedly only 100,000 yen, roughly $1,000 USD per month, with a crew of just a few animators. Yet these constraints weren't a hindrance. They shaped the show's identity. When I first encountered Popee the Performer, I was an undergrad watching random videos late at night, letting the next suggestion take the wheel. I don't even want to know what my algorithm looked like for it to autoplay a nearly 3-hour compilation of all 39 episodes, but I watched it. All of it. In one sitting. I couldn't look away. It was like seeing a clown car crash in slow motion. To give you a basic understanding of what the show is like, it is set in a surreal, barren desert known only as the Wolf Circus. The series follows Popee, a hyper-competitive, occasionally murderous clown in training, and his silent, long-suffering, wolf-like companion, Kedamono. Later in the series, Popee's father, Popee, appears as a flamboyant and often godlike instructor, further unbalancing the already bizarre tone. Essentially, its structure has Popee kill his companion Kedamono, only for Kedamono to return unharmed in the next episode. There's no explanation, no continuity, and no moral lesson, just repetition. This contributes to the dreamlike, and at times nightmarish tone. However, the strangeness is not random. It is deeply intentional. Popee the Performer was created by Ryuji Masuda, a Japanese director known for his unique and unconventional animation style. Masuda, who would later go on to create the similarly offbeat Mr. Stain on Junk Alley, clearly thrives on limitation. In both shows, he transforms minimalism into something expressive. Both shows use 3D CGI, visual repetition, and sound effects in place of spoken language. However, while Mr. Stain explores loneliness and beauty in a junk-filled alley, Popee focuses on chaotic violence in an empty desert. That emptiness isn't just visual, it's conceptual. The vast, lonely space strips away narrative filler and forces viewers to focus entirely on the interactions between the characters. There is no dialogue, no world-building lore, no conventional plot. Instead, there are repetitions of circus acts gone wrong, comedic violence that escalates to absurdity, and dreamlike logic that often leaves viewers unsettled. Masuda himself has spoken about his artistic approach, how he embraces limitations, and how he uses repetition, silence, and absurdity to express emotions that cannot be easily verbalized. While Popee is often labeled as meaningless chaos, the show can be interpreted as a reflection of emotional repression and the contradictions of childhood. In many episodes, Popee exhibits childish emotions, jealousy, spite, pride, but responds in exaggerated, violent ways. Kedamono, meanwhile, often suffers silently or attempts to escape. The show's lack of dialogue forces viewers to interpret meaning through movement and action. This simplicity allows Popee to function almost like a wordless stage play, where the visual storytelling takes center stage. There is no moral of the story, but that's precisely why the show resonates. It reflects the confusion and instability, especially in childhood, when feelings are often strong but inexpressible. Masuda uses surreal comedy and a form of grotesqueness to dramatize those inner contradictions, turning limited resources into a powerful aesthetic. It's a piece that works precisely because of its boundaries. When discussing this series, Masuda cited as inspirations the surreal stop-motion paranoia of Czech animator Jan Švankmajer and the physical comedy and extreme violence of Looney Tunes-style slapstick. Like Popee, Czech animator Jan Švankmajer is another animator making surreal works that explore themes like psychological discomfort and act as subtle critiques of authoritarianism and repression, especially during Czechoslovakia's communist period. You can see some of these themes in his famous films like Dimension of Dialogue from 1982, where you see two clay heads devour and recreate each other in endless cycles. Often, he uses clay and household items to create visually unsettling imagery as a commentary on communication, power, and self-destruction. Another example is his short film Food from 1992, which is a triptych of surreal vignettes showing how people eat different meals. In this one, he uses a type of puppetry having actors animated, combined with claymation, to show different men getting food from a human puppet, then becoming a puppet themselves for the next man in line as a satire of human routines and consumerism. His work then continued to inspire others, such as Tim Burton, in his own stop-motion films, and famous animators in Japan, like Satoshi Kon, in his works Paprika and Perfect Blue. In a way, all of these pieces explore our relationship with the absurd. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus describes the absurd as the divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. In this work, Camus uses the myth of Sisyphus, who is condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, as a metaphor for the human condition. In this, life may be inherently meaningless, but by consciously accepting that meaninglessness and continuing to live fully and defiantly, we find freedom and dignity. In Camus' view, Sisyphus is heroic because he doesn't seek escape. He embraces the absurd and chooses to go on anyway. In this, we seek purpose, but the universe offers silence. Yet this isn't a cause for despair, it's a call to revolt. The absurd must be embraced, not escaped. However, for a writer like Kierkegaard, the absurd is the paradox at the heart of faith. How can the infinite become finite? How can God become man? He proposes a leap of faith, not rational belief, but committing to the absurd in the absence of proof. Unlike Camus, he sees transcendence as possible, but only through subjective faith in the face of absurdity. Kafka, on the other hand, looks at the absurd as bureaucracy. In this, he reveals the absurd through social systems, like legal trials with no charges, or people turning into insects. The absurd here is not cosmic, but institutional, but also not meaningless, but obscure and ungraspable. Franz Kafka's stories often depict people trapped in confusing, endless systems, such as governments, courts, or workplaces, that fail to explain themselves, make no sense, and show no concern for the individual. These systems are huge, slow, and cold, but people still try to understand them, follow their rules, or get justice from them. For example, in the trial, a man named Joseph K. is arrested one morning for a crime, but no one tells him what the crime is. He goes from office to office, judge to judge, trying to defend himself. He never finds out what he's accused of. Every answer only leads to more confusion. Eventually, he is executed without understanding why. In this absurdity, the system gives him silence, paperwork, and endless loops. Humans want meaning, fairness, and answers, but the systems they live under are too complex, silent, or illogical to provide any. In Kafka's works, present the absurdity of human existence through oppressive systems, such as law courts or faceless bureaucracies. His characters seek answers, justice, or connection, but the world they live in responds with silence, nonsense, or cruel repetition. The key feeling is alienation. The self is lost inside a system that cannot be understood. Works like Haruki Murakami's novel Kafka on the Shore combine the Western existential absurdity and Japanese metaphysical ephemerality. The protagonist, Tamura Kafka, who you might notice is named after Kafka, seeks to escape fate. Much like Joseph K. in the trial, he enters strange, unexplainable realities. But here, the landscape is shaped not by gray office corridors, but by forests, dreams, and gods. Murakami borrows Kafka's absurdity, but blends it with the concept of borderlessness, where time, identity, and self are never fixed. Where Kafka's absurdity is brutal and desolate, Murakami imbues absurdity with beauty, ambiguity, and even healing potential. In both Kafka and Murakami, there is an absurdity of control, the instability of meaning, and the isolation of the individual. When we examine examples of surreal storytelling, we experience aesthetic and emotional resonance in something entirely irrational or illogical, even meaningless by conventional standards in some cases. In this, we are experiencing entertainment from its own absurdism, which arises from the ways in which these types of work create implications in their meaninglessness. It's not chaos per se, but the gap between the world's indifference and our desire for order and understanding. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. So, when we look at the beauty of the absurd, we're trying to capture a strange sense of emotional or aesthetic rightness in something that makes no rational sense, an experience that transcends logical structure, often hitting something deeper or more primal. The sublime is an experience that overwhelms our senses or reason, often blending terror and awe, kind of like the terror and awe we feel watching Popee aggressively murdering his wolf friend. Philosophers like Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant defined the sublime as an experience that arises when the mind encounters something vast, uncontrollable, or unknowable, and survives that confrontation. For example, when we stand before a stormy ocean or witness examples of how massive and uncaring our universe can be. However, when examining these surreal examples of chaotic and almost grotesque works, such as Popee, the beauty in the works becomes less apparent. Part of this comes from a long-standing understanding of beauty through the framework rooted in Western aesthetics, particularly the Greek idea of kalokagathia, the belief that physical beauty, kalos, is linked to moral goodness, agathos, inherited by Roman and Christian traditions, oftentimes conflating beauty with goodness. In this, goodness is visually reflected in the body. For example, saints are beautiful. Ugliness is linked to moral failure. For example, villains are grotesque or malformed. So even before the idea of the grotesque enters the frame, there's an underlying binary: beautiful equals good, ugly equals bad. This is reflected in art history, where saints and martyrs are often idealized as serene and beautiful, even in suffering or death. However, the strict binary doesn't capture the beauty we find in the grotesque. This comes from the same way we can find beauty in the greatest absurdity in a human's life: death. This relation of death and beautiful may seem paradoxical. After all, death is rooted in extremely negative emotions like loss, grief, and absence. But across philosophy, art, and spiritual traditions, death has often been seen as profoundly, even painfully beautiful. For example, studies like Is Aesthetic Good?, a study on the aesthetic and vitality judgment of pictorial representations of the dead, saints and non-saints, by Schieppati et al., explore how viewers perceive beauty and vitality in images of dead people, particularly saints versus non-saints. In this research, death complicates our notions of beauty. The grotesque lies in liminality between life and death, beauty and decay, sanctity and flesh. Even in death, saints were seen as beautiful, but less alive, less human. This suggests that the idealized dead saint might verge into a space where beauty becomes inhuman, almost ethereal. Conversely, the non-saint, who seems more alive in death, may be tapping into an uncomfortable corporeal realism, something closer to the grotesque. In a sense, the line between things that are fragile or fleeting and our understanding of our own imminent existentialism. In Bakhtinian thought, the grotesque body is earthy, excessive, leaking. It disturbs ideal forms. Grotesque figures resist perfection, thus disrupting the beautiful good stereotype. The grotesque forces viewers to confront the reality of death, not its sublimation. In this, the absurd can be sublime when it disorients us in a way that expands our perception. It's the beauty of confronting meaninglessness without despair, a kind of transcendence through absurdity. Absurd moments can be beautiful precisely because they don't last or make sense. In this, absurdity becomes a space for emotional projection and intuitive meaning. What makes works like Popee the Performer interesting is how their use of the grotesque and absurdity, be it for comedy or tragedy, provokes awe in their viewer. But why? Perhaps the best way to explore this understanding is in the genre of horror itself. After all, Popee the Performer has been described as a kid-friendly entry into the horror genre. Horror often forces us to confront the most profound existential truth: we will die. In this sense, horror is a modern form of memento mori, Latin for remember that you must die. A genre that asks us not to turn away from death, but to look directly at it. Horror makes death not abstract, but embodied. A corpse, a monster, a haunted house, a ghost. It's no longer a concept, but a presence. Death is something so vast or terrifying that it exceeds comprehension, producing awe and fear at once. Horror often invokes this kind of emotional overload, so that death is no longer just feared, but also something to draw entertainment from. Often we try to repress things that we fear to protect ourselves, but horror breaks through that repression. It shows us the corpse, the violence, the transformation from human to other. It forces us to feel what we usually ignore. Julia Kristeva's theory of the abject is especially relevant here. In this, the abject is something we reject to preserve our sense of self, like blood, pus, or the corpse. Horror reveals this abject and forces us to question the boundary between self and non-self, life and death. Because of this, horror often evokes aesthetic pleasure. In horror, the grotesque often becomes stylized, a beautifully composed shot of a decaying body, or the tragic grace of a ghostly figure. Horror aestheticizes what we normally reject, bringing us close to the romantic sublime, where terror is intertwined with wonder. Additionally, horror can also become an outlet to process trauma, anxiety, and loss. Through horror, we ritualize what cannot be spoken, and sometimes find peace in confronting the end. In other words, horror allows us to confront both the incomprehensible, things beyond reason or natural law, the immense, the vast forces, whether divine or monstrous, and the liminal, the boundaries between life and death, natural and supernatural, human and otherworldly. In this way, how horror often overlaps with religion becomes much easier to understand. In many religious traditions, the divine is both terrifying and beautiful, a tension famously described by theologian Rudolf Otto in The Idea of the Holy, where he introduces the concept of the numinous. In this, Otto argues that religious experience is a mix of mysterium, tremendum, and fascinans. Mysterium being something wholly other or unknowable, tremendum being fear and dread before divine power, and fascinans being an attractive, compelling pull. This structure fits horror perfectly, as most stories in the genre work by evoking mystery and presenting the threat of death or madness to trigger terror, making it impossible to look away. So horror becomes a secular or symbolic expression of the same emotional complex as religious awe. Philosophers like Georges Bataille and Julia Kristeva argue that horror and sacred rituals both share a fascination with death, transgression, and the abject, that which disturbs identity or system. In works like The Accursed Share and Erotism, Death and Sensuality, Bataille argues that the sacred is not distant from horror, it is rooted in it. The sacred, for him, is not just holy or pure, it is dangerous, forbidden, and intimately tied to death. Ancient religious rituals, like sacrifice, taboo, and purification, weren't just symbolic. They were ways to confront the unknowable and structure social order by flirting with chaos. He draws heavily on anthropology, especially the work of Durkheim and Mauss, to argue that sacred rituals were often horrific. Blood, dismemberment, and ecstasy were not opposites of the holy, they created it. The domain of the sacred is the domain of what is separated from the profane, but it is also the domain of death, of the infinite, of the impossible. For Bataille, both horror and religion have in common the transgression, the crossing of forbidden boundaries. Eroticism, violence, and death all break everyday continuity. In confronting death or taboo, such as through horror or ritual, we are temporarily lifted out of our individual selves and confronted with something larger, unknowable, which he calls continuity, which is a loss of ego or a kind of spiritual communion. Horror stories, like religious rituals, stage this process safely for the viewer, offering a glimpse of sacred excess without demanding full participation. In Powers of Horror, Kristeva describes abjection, a psychological state where something is expelled from the self, yet remains disturbingly close. The abject is not fully object or subject. It is what we must reject to form an identity. For example, corpses, blood, filth, and bodily waste are not just gross. They are existential threats because they remind us of our fragility, mortality, and the breakdown of meaning. It is thus not lack of cleanliness or health that causes abjection, but what disturbs identity, system, order. Horror fiction and film often stage encounters with the abject, what culture has cast out to maintain symbolic order. When you recoil from a corpse or vomit at gore, you're not just grossed out. You're confronting a crisis of identity and meaning. Kristeva also connects the abject to the maternal, specifically the pre-Oedipal mother-child bond. Before language and separation, we exist in a fluid unity with the mother. Horror arises when traces of this primal, pre-linguistic state resurface, threatening the symbolic structures, like law, order, and identity, that hold adult subjectivity together. This paradox, the sacred as both horrifying and beautiful, is central to how we glimpse divinity through destruction, which we can also find in Popee the Performer. Set in a surreal, barren desert known only as the Wolf Circus, Popee the Performer allows us to glimpse into this very paradox. It portrays a character who exhibits childish emotions, a fundamental aspect of human development, but exaggerates them in violent ways, forcing Kedamono to suffer. Their relationship is a metaphor for the unstable emotions and power dynamics we often experience but cannot express as children. It isn't about the moral of the story, but instead a reflection of the absurd that we face as children, especially when we are still too young to grasp the complex and violent emotions in our understanding of the world. The grotesque repetition dramatizes those inner contradictions, masked by the dark comedy the show adopts. At its core, Popee the performer is an artistic expression of absurdism. Like Camus' Sisyphus, Popee's world is one of endless repetition without explanation or redemption. Kedamono dies and comes back. Popee performs violence for no reason. There is no resolution, no progression, and no narrative comfort. But in this relentless loop of slapstick cruelty, the show confronts us with a core existential truth. Life is often irrational, cruel, and senseless. But we go on. There is a strange dignity and wonder in survival without meaning. Popee becomes sacred through its transgressions. The grotesque violence, surreal logic, and total disregard for narrative convention strip away our symbolic defenses, just like ritual sacrifice, horror, or religious ecstasy. The grotesque becomes a threshold, a liminal space between self and other, chaos and order, child and adult. By showing the grotesque in bright colors and clown suits, the show plays out sacred terror in cartoonish form, turning trauma into ritual, suffering into structure, and abjection into art. It reveals what we try to repress: rage, fear, loss, confusion, all without language. The silence of the characters mirrors the pre-linguistic self, where emotions are raw and unfiltered. Children understand Popee, not in logic, but in feeling. The show speaks the language of untranslatable inner life. This is beautiful in the same way that a scream in a dream can be beautiful, not for what it says, but for what it lets escape. The final layer of Popee's beauty is that it is, at its core, about childhood, not the sanitized fantasy, but the real, contradictory storm of it. Popee's exaggerated emotions, Kedamono's silent endurance, the surreal acts of violence, all reflect how children feel intensely, act irrationally, and suffer without explanation. There's no lesson here because real childhood often has none. Instead, Popee the performer shows us what it feels like to be young, powerless, confused, and full of rage or wonder you can't explain. That is beauty. Not order, not clarity, but a brutal honesty. So, this is my first video. Thank you for watching. I'm not really a video essayist, more just an essayist, so I apologize if this is a bit of a slog to listen through. But to briefly introduce who I am a PhD student at Kyoto University who does research completely unrelated to anything in this video. But I made this video because I was randomly reminded of Popee the performer recently, and it sparked me falling down the rabbit hole of this show, which then, that rabbit hole led to me typing out a 12-page rant about all my thoughts, which then became this video. If you're curious to watch Popee the performer, basically the entire series is available free here on YouTube. I'm not sure if I'll make more rambles like this in the future, but if you're interested in what I had to say, let me know and I might consider it. Alright, bye.